синопописи. І сьогодні ми теж побачимо деякі фрагменти його фільмів, які будуть проаналізовані, якось прокоментовані. Так що раді вітати маршала Галі.
Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for coming. I guess maybe to start, I'm just going to show a couple of trailers, two trailers from two of my films, and it'll give you sort of a taste of the range of the films, and then afterwards, I'm kind of curious to hear what you all are interested in, because I can talk about lots of different types of things. I can talk about the business of documentary filmmaking, or the craft of shooting and editing, or other things that you might be interested in. So while you're watching the trailers, you can think about what you're interested in, and then we'll talk a little bit, and then I'll sort of go off and we'll talk and look at some clips, and hopefully it'll be interesting. But thanks so much for getting up this morning and being here. So if we can show both of the trailers,
yes.
Either one first.
I just would like to ask if everything good with translation. Чи все гаразд з перекладом, чи всі мають навушники? Будь ласка, візьміть.
Дуже тихо слышно.
Дуже тихо, а ви
На
маєте...
максимумі підняв, але щось там підсилено.
Треба вам замінити. Так що, будь ласка, хто не має навушників, візьміть, маєте переклад.
There's a third one as well that we'll look at a clip of in a little while that is about inner city politics. So in a city in America called Newark, New Jersey, not New York, but Newark is a city across the river that's got a lot of economic problems, crime problems. There was a very controversial, racially charged mayor's election between two African-American candidates. So there's a pretty huge range of topics, and usually when I'm looking for a topic or something to make a documentary about, there's just something that grabbed my attention. It's not as if I'm always interested in making films about one thing or another. But before I sort of jump in and talk about making documentary films, I actually am curious to open it up and find out from you all why you're here, what you're hoping to hear, or what you're interested in. So anybody can speak up, and I'll pop these on so that I know what you're saying. Don't be shy.
Пожалуйста, микрофон говорите, чтобы переводчик мог.
Мене звати Андрій. Скажіть, будь ласка, от як ви підбираєте теми для своїх фільмів, на що ви насамперед звертаєте увагу, і чому ви знімаєте фільми саме на ці теми чи на інші? І можете розказати детальніше про команду, яка працює над вашими фільмами, скільки там позицій, скільки там людей, і хто взагалі працює в цих фільмах? Дякую.
Okay. Maybe what we'll do, let's hear a few different people say what they're interested in, and then we'll go back and address them through if that works.
Okay, I would ask in English, and I'm also director and interested in documentary, and I'm wondering how do you work with your heroes to open them and to have this good story in documentary.
How many people here are filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, or interested in the craft of making documentary films? Okay. And the rest of you, why are you here?
зовут Игорь, региональный партнер фестиваля. Я президент киноклуба «Восхождение». Это старейший киноклуб в нашей стране. Ему 35 лет. И мы стараемся привозить в наш город значимых людей в области кино. Поэтому я здесь.
Я Николай, режиссер из Киева. Я просто смотрел ваш фильм «When a Tree Falls», когда дерево падает. Просто у меня возник вопрос со свободой слова и защитой прав человека в Америке, да? Потому что Америка это государство, которое практически себя называет борцом за права человека, да? А реальность этого фильма такова, что я вижу, что там ситуация, в общем-то, не лучше, чем во всем остальном мире, да? Какие конкретно проблемы у вас возникают во время съемки фильма? И есть ли давление какое-то государства на процесс производства фильма, на вас как на человека, гражданина и режиссера, да? И в результате, скажем, есть ли какие-то проблемы с тем, чтобы свободно этот фильм представлять, да? Делали вы какие-то сознательные также изменения в фильме, чтобы этот фильм имел возможность быть показанным? И существует ли вообще такая проблема настолько глубоко, да, что если что-то вы затрагиваете не то, что нужно, ваш фильм могут просто запретить?
Yeah. Okay.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Анастасия, я режиссер эстрады, но хочу переквалифицироваться и стать режиссером кино. У меня к вам такой вопрос. Известно, что у каждого выдающегося режиссера есть свой стиль, своя стилистика. Как бы вы могли охарактеризовать ваши конкретные художественные образы, с которыми вы работаете, и как вы это выражаете? Может быть, в 3 словах.
Hi, my name is Dima. I'm a director, and I would like to ask you some question from actor's retrospective. Could you talk something about acting mastery, acting skills, and how do you work with actors? Would you like to act on their own, or would you like to direct your actors?
Okay. This is great. So this gives me just a sense of generally what people are interested in. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then translation throwing me off just a little bit. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we can come back and hit some of these questions. Some of the things that I was planning to talk about, I think, touch these questions. In other cases, maybe not so much, and we'll talk about them more broadly. But just to give you a little bit of background about me, I was not a filmmaker, but I haven't been sort of always interested in being a filmmaker. I like documentary films and liked them. When I was in college is when I really started to discover them. But I zigzagged. My career zigzagged after college. I studied comparative religion in college and graduated, and I moved to Mexico and taught English and studied Spanish in Mexico. And then I did a number of different jobs. I worked in public radio. I taught high school students. I did an academic fellowship in philosophy and history and economics of nonprofits, and finally moved back to New York. I'd grown up in New Jersey. Moved back to New York just before the internet really took off, and I started working at a company that was doing interactive documentaries for museums, and they were sort of exhibits in museums where you touch different parts of the computer screen and it'll play short 1 or 2 minute documentaries. And I did that for a couple of years, and then the internet happened. and the company sort of morphed into an internet design company, and so I stayed there and learned how to do that, and did the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website and some other things. And then I had this sort of nagging feeling that I had always wanted to make documentary films since discovering them. I mean, you know, it had been something in the back of my mind, and I had sort of put it off and thought, well, I don't know people who make documentary films. That seems like something that other people get to do. It's like being a rock star or something like that, like something that maybe you imagine, but you don't really get to do. And so, but I was sort of hitting this point in my life where I thought, the window is closing on this, and if I don't try, then I'm going to be 98 on my deathbed, and I'm going to think, you know, I probably should have tried. It's kind of lame that I didn't even try. And so I said, well, I'm just going to take 1 year, and I'm going to take a year, and I'm going to try to make a documentary film, and we'll see what happens. And maybe I will hate it, and maybe I'll be terrible at it, but at least I'll know. At least I won't be 98 thinking, oh, it's too bad I was too afraid to try it. At least I'll know. And maybe I'll like it. And so I bought a camera, and I hadn't been to film school, but I bought a camera, and I read the manual, and I went out and started shooting this election in New Jersey. I had just recently, before deciding to make the film, I had met one of the candidates who decided he was going to run. And so I thought it was going to be an interesting film. And one of the things that I look for in making a documentary film, there are really three things that I look for in deciding on a topic. The first is whether there are charismatic characters. And it's hard to articulate exactly what makes somebody charismatic, but there are some people who you just want to listen to, and you just want to watch. And there are other people who, not so much. I met this young guy who was going to run for mayor, and he had this amazing charisma. He was very smart. He was a Yale Law School graduate, a Stanford football star, and a Rhodes Scholar. And he also just had this way of talking and way of relating to people that a lot of people said was sort of like Bill Clinton. And he was running against a guy who had been the mayor for 16 years and was going for his 5th term as mayor. And this guy was very charismatic, but in a very different way. He was very funny, and he was kind of outrageous. And people loved the way that he would defend the city and sort of tweak outsiders, and was very proud of Newark, of the city. But he was also pretty widely known to be corrupt. But people felt like, you know, he was their guy. He had grown up in their town. He represented them. And so they sort of turned a blind eye to the corruption because he was their guy. And so this was going to be a very interesting election where you had two very strong characters. The second thing that I look for is some sort of a narrative arc. So something that has a built-in story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and stakes that either somebody wins or loses, somebody gets them or they don't get them. And an election is a great film. It's got a great structure because you have two people. They both say, we're going to run for this office, and some stuff happens, and then at the end, one of them wins and one of them loses. And over the course of the movie, you're wondering what's going to happen, who's going to win and who's going to lose. So the structure is great. My second film that I made is about 3 kids who want to become NASCAR drivers, race car drivers, when they grow up. And the movie follows a series of 5 races that determine who the national champion in this racing series is that kids race in. And again, I had 3 very charismatic kids. I had an arc, 5 races over the course of the year, who's going to win and who's going to lose. My third film is about a guy who's facing life in prison for committing arson when he was part of a radical environmental group called the Earth Liberation Front. And in that case, the narrative arc of the story is this guy at the beginning of the movie is arrested, and what's going to happen? Is he going to go to prison for the rest of his life? Is he going to get off? Is he going to take a plea? What's going to happen? So the second thing, first thing was charismatic characters. Second thing, narrative arc. And there are plenty of movies, great documentaries, that don't have a narrative arc. But it's much more difficult. So to me, having that arc is sort of like insurance, that I don't have to find the thing that will make the story interesting. It gives you a spine when you're starting. And so all of the details and all of those kind of magic moments that fill out the movie can happen, and there's a place to put them, as opposed to just starting from scratch and trying to figure out what's going to make this story interesting. And then the third thing that I look for is some sort of issue that engages me, that interests me. And it doesn't have to be a political issue. A lot of times it is. And if there can be 2 issues, then that's even better. Because if you're making a movie that's 90 minutes, you really want to defy expectations. You don't want to kind of hit the same note over and over and over and over for 90 minutes. That to me gets kind of tired. So it's nice if your movie can be like a circus tent that has 2 poles in it, so that you introduce your first topic, you explore it, you play it out, and then somewhere around minute 50, you introduce your next topic and explore it. Or at least you have 2 things that are going. So in my first film, it's about political corruption, but it's also about race and racial identity. Both of the candidates in the election are black, but the older candidate accuses the younger candidate of not being really black. And so the argument was that because he had gone to Yale and because he'd grown up in the suburbs, he had somehow given up his, racial authenticity. And that's actually been an issue that people have argued about in America. I mean, when the movie came out before Obama was elected president, but during his election, there was this question of like, well, what are you? Are you black? Are you white? Are you, who are you? Because he defies stereotypes. So those were the 2 questions of that film. In Racing Dreams, it's sort of about racing, but most of the film is about adolescence, and it's about being 12 and figuring out who you are and figuring out your relationship with your parents, what romance feels like for the first time, questions like that. And the third film is about environmentalism, but it's also about terrorism. How do we define terrorism? And the guy who faced life in prison faced that much time because the government considered him to be a terrorist. And so one of the questions in the film is, do these arsons qualify as terrorism? So those are sort of the topics that those are the 3 things that I look for. So when I was making this first film, it seemed to have all of those things. So I went to Newark and I filmed this election, and it was an amazing election. the amount of political corruption surprised me. I got pulled into the story when the police came after me for trying to make this film. And there are a number of scenes in the film where, you know, the police at one point break my camera while I'm trying to film the movie. And it seemed to me like an amazing story. I tried to raise money to pay for the editing, and nobody would give me money. And in retrospect, I understand that. I mean, I'd never made a film before, and it's really, really hard, even if you have a good story, to make a good film. So I took another leave of absence from the company, and I bought a secondhand Macintosh and got a copy of Final Cut Pro, and I took a weekend class in how to do Final Cut Pro, and I sat in my apartment for about a year and a half, and every morning I got up and I had hundreds of hours of footage and tried to figure out how to make a movie out of this spaghetti of footage, and it was for me a great film school. I mean, the shooting, every day, you know, I would come home after shooting all day and I would look at the footage, and I shot, you know, 200 hours of footage, and the first 50 are a lot worse than the last 50, because every day I was out there and I was figuring out how to frame shots, what's the material that I need, what combinations of wide shots and close-up shots, and how to keep an eye on the light, depth of field, and all of those things I learned by doing it and making mistakes and then examining my mistakes. The same with the editing. I mean, I would sit and I would say, do we start with a wide shot and then go to a close-up, or do we start with a close-up and then go to the wide, and trying to figure out the vocabulary of filmmaking. And, you know, it was very, very hard. The work was very hard, but also because it was my first film, I was plagued with self-doubt. You know, I had no idea if I was just wasting my time. You know, my mother would call me and she would say, so, how's it going? Are you making progress? What's going on? And, you know, I had a good job with health insurance and a salary, and here I was just month after month after month sitting in this apartment by myself, as far as she knew, like doing nothing, just wasting my time. But I finally finished a cut of the film that was about 100 minutes long, and I took it to PBS, which is America's public broadcasting network, and they said, this is really good, and so they gave me money to finish the film, and I could pay for all of the, you know, the color correcting and the audio mixing and archival footage licensing. But I still didn't know whether people would like the film. The film has a very raw style. I mean, it was just me with a tiny camera, and I was shooting and I was doing the sound and I was driving the car and getting the releases signed and everything, and it feels that way. So that it's not slick at all, and I thought, oh, this is embarrassing. And so I showed it at the Tribeca Film Festival, and also showed it at Hot Docs, which is a big documentary film festival in Toronto. And those two were happening the same week. And that week, I thought, you know, are people going to come to see the screening? You know, and I went to the screenings and I just sat in the back and I just thought, oh, please don't walk out. Just don't walk out, you know, just at least stay till the end. And the film won the audience award at both festivals and the grand jury prize at Hot Docs Festival in 1 week. And then it just sort of exploded and went on to get nominated for an Academy Award and for an Emmy Award, which is the television's version of the Academy Awards, and it was crazy. I mean, my wife and I had been talking about getting, you know, some pizzas and renting a projector to show this movie that I've been working on to my friends so that they could see what I've been spending all my time on. And then all of a sudden it's being aired nationally on television and on the BBC and around the world. And so that was kind of my first experience with making a documentary film. And you know, everything that I've done since then has been an incredible series of highs and lows. And you know, you get so excited when you're at the Academy Awards, but then you're back, you know, in the edit room with your next film, banging your head on the table, trying to figure out why this next project you're working on is so boring and doesn't make any sense. And so I feel like the number one personal characteristic that people need in order to make documentary films is persistence, because there's so many things lined up against you, whether it's how difficult it is to raise money, how difficult it is to just make a story, to be there when interesting things are happening, how hard it is to edit something that feels like a movie when you're starting with just raw footage that wasn't shot off of a script. It's not made by actors. It's just people doing stuff and trying to construct that into something that feels to an audience like a movie is incredibly difficult. Distribution is incredibly difficult. And all these things are lined up against you. And the only way to actually finish and to get your movies out there is by relentless persistence. In talking a little bit about the topics, there's a huge range of styles of documentary films. There are documentaries that are historical, that have, you know, professors sitting in chairs in front of bookshelves explaining things and intercut with archival footage that you know they found. Many of those are terrific. There are films like the ones that I make that are more narrative nonfiction. So they are true, but they're built in a dramatic way that follows the conventions of fiction film and introduces characters and has plot twists and dialogue and hopefully some sort of a dramatic conclusion. There are experimental documentaries like Koyanis Katsu. Has anybody ever seen that film? It's amazing. It's widely considered one of the great documentaries, but there's no story. It's just beautiful footage strung together with a Philip Glass score, and it's amazing. And there are stories that are personal narratives. So, you know, individuals going through their lives, figuring out, you know, their lives, and they can be quirky. To me, I don't feel like any of these styles are better or worse than any others. There's a great Duke Ellington quote where he said, "If it sounds good, it is good." And that's the rule in jazz music, but I think it's also the rule in documentary film. And a lot of it is just what personally interests you. So I have generally gone towards the narrative story. There's a great documentary that was very important to me in getting me started. Is a film called Hands on a Hard Body. which in English sounds sort of like a porn title or something like that. But in fact, it's a play on that. It's a film that's about a documentary film that's about the contest that they have in this little town in Texas, where people go to a truck dealer and they put their hand on the body of the truck, and the last person standing there with their hand on the truck wins the truck. And so it goes on for days and days, where people are exhausted and they're hallucinating but if they take their hand off the truck, they're out. And so this contest, the movie follows this contest and it interviews the different people who are planning to do this, and it intercuts the interviews with the footage of them having this contest. And the movie cost about $1,000 to make. It was made by a couple of students with tiny cameras. It looks terrible, but it is incredibly great. And it is funny, and it's dramatic. And when I saw it, it showed me that if you have great characters and a good arc, everything else will be forgiven. And in some ways, it's the opposite of fiction film. With fiction film, you need everything to be good, or else the movie's bad. You have to have great sound, a great script, great acting, great shooting, and if any one of those things is not right, then the fiction film it doesn't work. So that was topics. One of the things that I learned when I was shooting was the importance of kind of putting people at ease. So the type of shooting that I do, is generally verite. In some cases, I'll talk to people, but usually I like to just sit back and watch them do things and be themselves. That can be really hard. A lot of times people want, when they're shooting that way, they want to disappear. And to me, it's less a goal of trying to disappear, because you're standing there in a room with somebody. Usually, after my first film, usually the team would be 2 people. So either I shoot and somebody else has a microphone and a mixer, or somebody's shooting and I have the microphone and mixer. You're not going to actually disappear. Nobody's really going to forget that you're there in the room. But my goal is not so much to disappear as to make people so comfortable that they don't mind that you're there, and that you feel like some other friend or family member that's just hanging out there in the room. There are a couple of ways of doing that. There's a famous documentary filmmaker, Albert Maysles, who made a number of the first American cinema verite films, and he and a couple of other D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hedges and a number of other filmmakers actually invented the technology that allowed you to do synchronized sound with a portable camera. But anyway, he told me at one point, one trick that he uses when he's shooting that way is that he always points the camera at people, even when he's not shooting. Because your temptation is to put the camera down and then when something interesting happens, to pick it up. But when you do that, you break everybody's senses that the camera's gone up now, and you break the dynamic of the room. So what he does, and what I try to do as well, and have found that it works very well, is that if you're always pointing the camera at people, people can be on their best behavior for a half an hour, or an hour, or maybe even 2 hours, but not for 5 hours. And eventually, you break them down. Of course, if your camera has a light on the front, you've got to put a little piece of tape over that or turn it off, because you don't want people to be able to see when you're shooting and when you're not shooting. And I'll even tell people that I'm doing that. I'll say, at the beginning, I'm going to point the camera at you. Most of the time, I'm not shooting. You're never going to know, so just don't try to figure it out. And again, that over time actually puts them at ease because they just get used to that being the dynamic. The other thing is that I'm constantly trying to predict what's going to happen in a scene and get the pieces that I will need in order to build that scene. So, you know, in some cases it's a combination of tight shots, establishing shots. What are all of the different blocks? And I feel like to be a good cinematographer of verite documentaries, it's really, really important to edit as well, and to have spent a lot of time trying to cut footage together into a scene, into a movie, because you begin to realize how important it is to do certain things and to get certain types of shots. That if you never see the result of what you're shooting, it's easy to forget. The other thing is that I think shooting documentaries requires the combination of being prepared and flexible. And so on one hand, you have to go into a scene knowing what you think might happen and trying to get the material that you'll need to tell that scene. But on the other hand, you have to be willing to change if something different happens. And you know, one of my favorite filmmakers is a guy named Ross McElhenney. And he has a scene in his most famous film called Sherman's March, where he is interviewing a minister, an American Baptist minister, who's talking about the apocalypse, the end of the world, when Jesus comes back and metes out justice on the unbelievers. And it's this great bit where this guy is talking, and there's a little girl who's sitting next to him, and she looks off the camera and she starts making a face at something that's happening off to the side. And if I had been the person shooting that scene, I would have thought, this girl is screwing up the scene. She's totally distracting, and I would have gone in a little bit tighter and tried to crop her out of the scene, or say, what are you doing? You're messing up my scene. And, but he doesn't do that. He stays wide, And then at a certain point, he turns to look at what the girl's looking at. And she's looking at a guy in an Easter Bunny suit. And suddenly this scene becomes hilarious and becomes a comment on consumerism and religion, and what does the Easter Bunny have to do with Easter, really? And, you know, it just becomes this incredibly rich, great moment because he was willing to let this scene that he thought was going to be an interview about the apocalypse become something different. And so I feel like that combination of being willing to go places where you can't script it are what make documentaries so fun. I mean, for me, the very best moments of the documentaries that I've made have all been moments that surprised me at the moment that they happened. They were things that people said or things that happened that were totally unscripted and that I never could have scripted even if I wanted to. And that's what, and an audience can feel that. I mean, that's what's so pleasurable about watching a documentary, is when things happen up there and you think, that's real, that's life, that's so much better than the schlock that, you know, comes out of the Hollywood factory. You know, one of the other things that has been difficult for me as I've become a shooter is shooting people when they have when they're in difficult situations. And all three of the films that I've done have had people who had moments when they wished that I wasn't there to film. And the thing that I hate, I mean, one of the things that I love about making documentaries is the way that it pushes me to get involved in people's lives who I don't know. And it gives me an excuse to go into worlds that I don't know anything about. I didn't know about race car driving. I didn't know about inner city politics. I didn't know about radical environmentalists. But in the process of making these films, I could go in and ask people questions, personal questions, and find out about their lives in ways that I never could have done it if I weren't making a film. But the thing that I hate is that that there are times when you have to do things that make you uncomfortable as a person. And it's a tricky balance because you know, in America we have a tradition, I don't know what your news is like, but there are local news stations that if somebody's, you know, child is murdered, they'll show up with a camera. How does it feel that your child was murdered last night? And it's horrible. I mean, it's just, they're vultures. And I don't want to be one of those people. And yet I know that if something horrible happens to somebody who's part of a film that I'm making, I have to capture that for the film. And I think that there are different ways that you can tell the same story. There are some ways that sensationalize stories, or that treat people like objects. And there are some ways of exploring somebody's stories that elicit empathy from an audience. Because to me, the goal is for an audience to say, I relate on some level to the thing that's happening on screen. And it's very different to watch somebody on screen as a voyeur than it is to watch somebody on screen and to empathize with them. And if you can tell stories that pull audiences out of their lives and out of their comfort zones and stretch them to see the world from somebody else's point of view, that to me is the goal. That's my goal in making documentaries. But and doing that requires being with people when things are good, and also being with people when things are bad. And so in order to kind of deal with that, I will tell people in advance, there may be things that are going to happen to you over the course of shooting this movie that you're going to wish I weren't there, you know, that you're going to wish I weren't around for. And I actually, if somebody asks me to turn off the camera, I will. And I will tell them that. You know, I'll try to say, are you sure? I think this is okay. But if I feel like if I let somebody into my house with a camera, I should be the one who decides what they film and what they don't film. And so ultimately I think that letting people know that they have that control makes them less likely to need to use it. My dad was just sick and had to get an MRI, so you know they had to put him through one of those devices, you know, where you're claustrophobic in there as they're analyzing you, and he said it was really claustrophobic while he was in there, and he even had this moment of feeling of panic where he wanted them to stop it, but they gave him a button, and they said, here's this button. If you push the button, we'll stop it and pull you, and it'll turn off the machine, and you'll be pulled out. And he said, just knowing that he had that button made him fine with the experience of being in there. And so, to me, I feel like letting somebody know that if you really, really want me to, I'll turn off the camera. I respect you enough put you in control, keeps them from feeling the panic that that would make them want to have you turn off that camera. But I also think there are things that you can do in terms of, you know, making eye contact with people and that help. But ultimately, it is the thing that I hate most about making documentaries, because as much as you might try to humanize the experience, you're watching somebody who you've developed some sort of relationship with, you care about in some way, but you can't be a normal human being. You can't hug them or whatever. You have to be thinking about whether the shot is in focus, whether the audio is being recorded properly, whether the batteries are about to die, whether there's enough light in the room to get the shot that you need. You have to be able to think about those things. And if you can't, then you won't be able to make those kinds of films that have those kinds of moments. But that's always been one of the things that was most difficult for me. I'm just going to talk about a basic thing about editing, and then we'll watch a clip that sort of illustrates it. To me, one of the things that I try to do when I'm editing, there's a little card up above my computer where I edit, and it says two things. One is, I didn't know that, and the other is, what happens next? I didn't know that, and what happens next? And it's my goal over the course of the movie to, every 5 minutes or so, have people in the audience say one of those things. And if they don't, then the movie's starting to lose momentum. So if you can show people, if you can introduce things to people that they don't know, that defy their expectations, that is always inherently interesting. You know, if you can zig when people think you're going to zag, that engages an audience. As soon as an audience has a sense of where you're going with something, and then you go there, they start to lose interest. And so just peppering your film with bits of information that people don't know is great. And then the second thing is just constantly driving them towards what's going to happen. And there are lots of ways of, generally I like to create a question and then answer it, rather than answering questions that people haven't asked yet. A documentary, in my mind, is very different from, you know, a legal argument or an article, a news article, or something like that, which is about, you know, conveying information. There is hopefully information conveyed in a documentary film, but it needs to be conveyed in a way that feels like a movie, and that is entertaining and emotionally engaging. And so I feel like if you can create questions before you answer them, then you give an audience that sense of satisfaction, instead of having the thing feel like a lecture where it's delivering information that you're just supposed to take and digest. And there are lots of ways of doing that. In some ways, it's the case of having the overall arc do that. In other cases, it can be just the way that you edit a single scene. And it can be as small as the choices you make for which shots to put first. So, you know, traditionally, most of the time, a film will start with a wide shot. It's an establishing shot. It gives you a sense of where you are and who's in the room and what's going on. And then it goes in for a detail, somebody talking or something tight. But when I was editing Street Fight, one of the things that I kept doing, which seemed more fun to me, was starting with tight shot, and people say, "What is that?" And then going wide and answering their question. And when you see the examples of it here, it's not all that. I mean, it's not like, oh, great, what a revelation. But just by doing it, it keeps people paying attention just a teeny bit more. Most people wouldn't even notice that was what had just happened. But I think it does. Or you see a person and they talk and you think, I wonder who that person is. And then it is revealed who that person is. Or people are talking about a topic and you don't know what they're talking about, and then you figure out what they're talking about, as opposed to setting something up and then illustrating it. Instead, you can either make a point and then illustrate it, or you can tease the point with something that makes people lean forward and try to puzzle it out, and then answer it for them. So this scene in the campaign, just to remind you, the two candidates, Sharp James is the mayor. You'll see him. He's the one who's making the speech. He is the mayor, and he's been the mayor for 16 years. And Cory Booker is the person whose campaign we're inside of over the course of most of the movie. So we'll just watch this clip and then we'll talk about it afterwards. Cory explains something about policy, or a scene that's well, mostly just if there's something where there's information that needed to be conveyed, you had to convey it, but it wasn't going to be that fun to convey. You should put the blow up the building scene after that, because it kind of wakes people back up after this 2-minute lecture that they had to sit through. And so, so the order of scenes also can be an important part of building a thing. If you have a scary scene, if we have a tense scene, like there are scenes in the film where I get attacked by the police and they break my camera, and it's followed by a funny scene, because you sort of build this pressure and then you want to release it. So anyway, all of those are things that you do control. There's a great Alfred Hitchcock quote where he says, in fiction film, the director is God, but in documentary film, God is the director. And in some ways that's true. There are many things that you can't control, but it's nice to try to grab some of that power away from God when you're in the edit room. All of my films have some element of interviewing, and whether it's the professor in front of the bookshelf type interviewing, or whether it's somebody's cooking dinner and they explain to you something about what happened to them at work that day. All of that is interviewing. I generally prefer the kind where somebody's doing something, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it doesn't feel so much like an interview. It can be incorporated into verite footage, into footage of people, doing things in their lives, and it feels sort of texturally, it feels similar to that. It doesn't feel like you're being pulled out of the movie and then dropped back in, even though they're talking to somebody who's obviously making the film. But also, shooting people while they're doing things, it gives you a little editing advantage, because you can usually get close shots of what it is that they're doing. And you can use that while you're cutting to cover up your edits. So if somebody says something, then you can cut to their hands while you edit what they're, so that it's covering up the edit of what they're saying, and then come back to them. While if they're sitting looking at the camera, the only thing you can cut away to is archival footage or something like that. But the style of the tools or tactics of doing an interview are actually sort of similar in either situation. And one of the things that I think is helpful to keep in mind is, your number one goal is not to show that you're smart, and it's not to win an argument with somebody. Your goal is to get them to say the most interesting and revealing things that they can say. And a lot of times that requires you pretending like you are stupider than you actually are, in order to get them to explain things. Or if not stupider, at least less informed. And you are the stand-in for an audience that is not an expert in these topics. You're the advocate for your audience. You're representing your audience. And so you need people to explain things in ways that don't have jargon, in ways that are clear, in ways that are and in ways that feel genuine and revealing. And if they feel like you're an expert, they'll be much quicker to slip over into jargon. And for me, it's always been easier to do, because the 3 feature films that I've made have all been about things that I didn't know anything about. So for me, it's easy to appear stupid, because I am. And so, but I do think that puts people at ease. One of the things that I'll also do is I'll start with easy questions and work my way towards the difficult ones. And there's 2 reasons for doing that. If you're having an interview or a conversation with somebody about something that's controversial or that might upset them or be difficult for whatever reason, either emotionally or politically, it's a good idea not to lead with those questions, because there are 2 reasons. One is that you want to put people at ease, and so by talking to them about the really easy stuff, it gets them to put their guard down and to become comfortable with you. The second thing is that if somebody's going to get angry and stop the interview, at least you will have something that you've gotten by having built up to that point, instead of having them end the interview after your first question. So I always start with easy stuff. There are different schools of thought about whether to pre-interview people or how much to talk to them before you do an interview. I know somebody who worked with Michael Moore, and he never speaks to his subjects. They set up the room, they have the camera, they have the lights, the person's there, they put makeup on them if they do that. It's all completely controlled. They're sitting down, the microphone's on, and then he walks into the room and sits down and does the interview. And the reason that he does that is because he thinks, and I think this is true, that if you have spoken to people about the topic that they're going to talk about, then they know that you know things that you're asking them. And sometimes that'll come across in little verbal tics when they say things like, well, as I told you before, or as I was saying before, which ruins an interview bite. But also, even if they don't actually do that, when they're explaining something to somebody that they know already knows it, it's harder to be engaged. But if you're telling somebody a story that they've never heard before, or you're explaining an idea that Michael Moore is saying, explain to me how this works, I don't understand how this works. It's much easier if you're explaining it to him and you believe that he doesn't know than if you think that we're just playing a game. And most people are not actors. So as a filmmaker, it's your job not to ask them to act. It's your job to create a situation where they can be who they actually are. And it's your job to take all of the weight of constructing the moment off of their shoulders. There are some people who will ask their subjects to repeat the question in the answer. So if I said to you, how old are you? You know, they would say, when I ask you how old you are, don't just say 21, because that's not helpful. I mean, most of the time, if you're going to edit the question out of the film, you can't just cut to somebody saying 21. You need them to say, I'm 21 years old. So a lot of times, filmmakers will ask their subjects to say, repeat the question in the body of your answer. That, to me, is asking somebody else to do your job. And it's a much easier way to do it, and I can't say that I've never asked a subject to do that, but it's a lazy way of interviewing somebody. To me, you need to be thinking about the way that you're editing, and so if you want somebody to answer, to tell you how old they are, you've got to construct the question in a way that will elicit that from them properly. And you know, one little trick that I use a lot is I'll ask two questions at the same time. So I'll say, you know, how old are you and where are you from? And if you do that, somebody can't say 21. They have to say, well, I'm 21 years old and I'm from Ukraine. And so there are things like that you can do to think carefully before you're sitting down about the way to construct questions. A lot of times I will kind of half ask a question and then let it dribble off and let somebody try to fix the moment. So you know, I might say, so that guy, Daniel McGowan, what's the deal with him? You know, tell me about him. Some very loose, very broad question that allows somebody to try to fill it in for themselves.